fortunes, the smartening up of the shops, and the construction of a new home for himself and his family near the seashore. Also, as we learn later in the fragment, commensurate rises in the costs of living, which make it a very appropriate text to be talking about today. Upon repair of the carriage and improvement to Mr. Parker's foot, the Parkers returned to Sanditon, bringing the Haywoods' eldest daughter Charlotte with them as their summer guest. And this is where the part in Sanditon really begins. Upon arrival in Sanditon, Charlotte meets the inhabitants of the town. Prominent among them is Lady Denham, the business partner I just mentioned. And she's a twice widowed woman who received a fortune from her first husband and a title from her second. Living with Lady Denham is her niece Clara Brereton, a sweet and beautiful yet impoverished young lady. Also living in Sanditon are Sir Edward Denham and his sister Esther, the nephew and niece of Lady Denham by her second husband. These siblings are poor, and they're thought to be seeking Lady Denham's fortune. And Sir Edward is described as a silly man, though handsome. And actually, Sir Edward Denham is one of my absolute favourite of Jane Austen's characters. He is a truly ridiculous man. And the way he talks about books is something that I think everybody needs to look at sometime in their lives. Anyway, after settling in with the Parkers and encountering various neighbours, Charlotte and Mr. and Mrs. Parker are then surprised by a visit from his two sisters and younger brother, all of whom are self-declared invalids. However, given their level of activity and seeming strength, Charlotte quickly surmises that their complaints are invented. And again, I just think these siblings are a fantastic kind of parody of invalidism in the period. They're hilarious. Diana Parker has come on a mission to secure a house for a wealthy family from the West Indies, although she's not specifically been asked to help them. And Charlotte brilliantly characterises her activities as activities run mad. Anyway, Diana also brings word of a second large party at girls' school intending to summer at Sanditon. This news causes a stir in the town, especially for Mr. Parker, who obviously really wants to promote the town. With the arrival of Mrs. Griffiths at Sanditon, it soon becomes apparent that the family from the West Indies and the girls' school group are one and the same. So this is a terrible disappointment because they think they're getting loads of visitors, and in fact, it's just one lot. The visitors consist of Miss Lamb, a teenage Antiguan English heiress, and the two Miss Beauforts, English girls just arrived from the West Indies. In short order, Lady Denham calls on Mrs. Griffiths to be introduced to Miss Lamb, the sickly and very rich young woman that she intends her nephew, Sir Edward, to marry. And also she wants them to buy milk from her milk asses as well. So she's kind of money grubbing. A carriage unexpectedly arrives bearing Sidney Parker, the middle Parker brother. Too many Parker siblings are hard to keep in your mind. He'll be staying in town for a few days with two friends who will join him shortly. Sidney Parker is about 27 or 28 years old, and Charlotte finds him very good looking with a decided air of fashion. And I think were Sanditon to have been completed, we'd have had a lot more of Sidney Parker. The book fragment ends, sadly, when Mrs. Parker and Charlotte visit Sanditon House, Lady Denham's residence. There, Charlotte spots Clara Brereton seated with Sir Edward Denham at her side, having an intimate conversation in the garden. She surmises they must have a secret understanding, though the narrative voice suggests that in fact Clara isn't at all taken in by Sir Edward, who intends to abduct her. And this is a lovely moment where Jane Austen says that Sir Edward has read far too much of Richardson's stories, and he's taken only the kind of desire to be like Lovelace from these very morally improving works. Anyway, he's determined he's going to abduct Clara, and he thinks he's really cut out for this role, but Clara sees completely through him, which is fabulous. When they arrive inside, Charlotte observes that a large portrait of Sir Henry Denham hangs over the fireplace, whereas Lady Denham's first husband, who owns Sanditon House, only gets a miniature in the corner. And as she puts it, he's obliged, as it were, to sit back in his own house and see the best place by the fire constantly occupied by Sir Henry Denham. So that's it. How the fragment would have developed and ended is anyone's guess. I know there's been a recent BBC series which gives some suggestions of how it would have developed. And there are actually a number of versions of Sanditon completed, some of them by Jane Austen's own family, which you can read if you have a taste for that sort of thing. But that's not the focus of my talk today. So instead, what I want to do is talk a little bit about my experience of teaching Sanditon and the other manuscript works on my advanced optional single author Jane Austen module to successive cohorts of fourth-year undergraduate students at my home institution, the University of Stirling. The overall purpose of the module is to study the works of Jane Austen and their reception in the English-speaking world using a number of different theoretical approaches. In the module, we think about the reception of Austen's works from the first readings of the novel by her family members and friends to the film and television adaptations of the present day. We consider which critical approaches are most pertinent to that study. Students study the novel's publishing history, they explore their reception and readerships, and they discuss adaptations into other media. In addition to the 6 complete novels, we read the juvenile works and unfinished manuscripts, including Sanditon and the Watsons. We also read James Edward Austenleigh's memoir of his aunt, and 2 creative responses to her works, Rudyard Kipling's short story, The Janeites, and a lovely short story that is much less well known by Paula Morris called Premises, where the idea is that you're someone pitching a Jane Austen novel to Hollywood moguls, and you try to pitch each one and each one and each one. And as it goes on, it's very funny. The moguls kind of make the novels less and less and less like Jane Austen until you end up with Wuthering Heights. Anyway, so we also watch a number of screen adaptations of the works, including the biopics Becoming Jane and Miss Austen Regrets, and the time travel series Lost in Austen. I don't know how many of you know those, but the students always take very well to those. In her fascinating article on teaching persuasion to resistant students in the federally registered Hispanic serving institution John Jay College in New York, Olivera Jokic suggests that her students' resistance is fundamentally rooted in their opposition to Jane Austen's treatment of class and gender, which they see to be conservative and hence in conflict with their own desire to criticise what she calls the ideologies, social norms, and historical patterns that shape the lives of individuals. My own cohorts of students from Stirling, too, are quite often resistant to the class dynamics of Austen's novels, in particular Emma, and to the conservative marriage plot endings of the novels. Unlike Jokic's students, however, my own tend to be much more open to seeing the subtle subversions of Jane Austen's depictions of class and gender. And my own belief is that this openness is because they read the manuscript works as well as the completed novels. Like her students, though, my own do commonly not see themselves as part of the privileged gentry class world depicted in Jane Austen's novels. Instead, they're often profoundly alienated from that world. And the characters with whom they have most sympathy are the outsider characters who have to move between socioeconomic groups over the course of the novel. So Fanny Price, Emma Watson, Jane Fairfax. These are the ones they think are relatable, to use that overused student term. Much of the scholarship on teaching Austen discusses the difficulty of overcoming students' existing preconceptions and prejudices about Austen and her work. Now, I know that in this room we don't have existing negative preconceptions and prejudices about Jane Austen, but believe me, they do exist out there in the world, I'm sad to say. So Misty Kruger, who's also written about teaching Austen, describes her students' preconceived ideas of Austen as a pretentious killjoy, which is what I've put on the screen there. Danielle Spratt suggests that the stereotype of the escapist Janeite, and by extension the perceived disconnect between Austen's novels and the 21st century world, pervades the media and haunts many of our students as they enter the classrooms. I'd add to this the stereotype of England's Jane, by which I mean tendencies to think about Jane Austen as national treasure, to associate her only with the country house beauties of the film adaptations. So one excellent reason, in my view, for teaching the manuscript works is then that they immediately disrupt such expectations. Of all Jane Austen's works, the Juvenilia and Sanditon are the most immediately and obviously satirical and subversive and the least escapist, I think. And to some of my Scottish students, at least, the history of England demonstrates Austen's sympathies with the Scottish underdog via its very explicit sympathy with Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Stuart dynasty more broadly, thus disrupting versions of Austen as England's Jane specifically. The manuscript works, therefore, introduce my students to a different kind of Jane Austen from the ones that they have been expecting. And these works can thus operate to defamiliarize the other known works, helping students to see the published novels in different ways. In fact, they operate to debunk a series of myths about Austen that the students have often encountered or imbibed without knowing they are doing so. That she is genteel, ladylike, precise, limited, a miniaturist, a romantic, with a small r rather than romantic, a large R novelist. The Juvenilia in particular show that almost no subject was off limits to the young Jane Austen, and this is what I love about them. With their delight in excesses of all kinds, their depictions of things we do not classically associate with Jane Austen, of drunkenness, murder, suicide, theft, violence. The beautiful Cassandra, for example, is a fantastic tiny novel in miniature, where Cassandra it's 12 tiny chapters, each chapter is just a sentence, where she goes around knocking people's caps off. She steals from a pastry cook, and she ends up exactly where she started. Anyway, that's by the by. In Sanditon, she returns to an intense focus on the body and on financial speculation. two topics that my students often believe Jane Austen knows nothing about. So they tend to see her as a novelist of thought, I suppose, rather than the body. The manuscript works also conclusively dispel the notion begun by Henry Austen that Jane Austen was an effortless writer, particularly since students can now see the extent of her revisions in the Sanditon manuscript and the cancelled chapters of Persuasion on the Jane Austen Fiction Manuscripts website, which I think I may have talked about last time. They therefore open up all sorts of discussions that are currently of interest to Austen scholars, about the position of professional women writers in the Romantic period, the expectations of the literary marketplace in Jane Austen's time, and the role and status of the novel. The manuscript works prepare students very well for what's sometimes called the subversive Austen critical tradition, which is a critical tradition that tries to get us to see the fun in Jane Austen, essentially. And also the kind of political engagement, and a great work in that line is Claudia Johnson's Jane Austen, Women, Politics, and the Novel of 1988. So the juvenile works then remind us that Jane Austen began her career as a parodist, and in so doing, they focus the students' attention on literary and historical context. Which are the works, genres, people, and ideas that the juvenilia parody, and why? They also help us direct our attention to techniques, because in the manuscript works, we see an author at work learning her craft in the juvenilia and then honing it in the later manuscripts. And what I've put on the screen there is an extract where you can see her really crossing out heavily, writing things in, changing stuff. So this is Jane Austen learning to write really. Finally, as Michelle Levy has perceptively argued, attention to the manuscript works as manuscripts allows us to see how Austen's published works have been subjected to the normalizing processes of print, in which spelling has been regularized, evidence of revision has been removed, abbreviations expanded, and so on. For all these reasons, therefore, I think teaching the manuscript works provides a series of exciting opportunities that help students to see Jane Austen and her works with fresh eyes. On my Austen module, then, I teach the juvenilia and the later and unfinished manuscripts in 2 consecutive weeks of the course, after the students have read all the 6 completed novels and immediately before they encountered James Edward Austen Lee's memoir. I deliberately structured the course in this way, violating the otherwise straightforward chronological structure of the module, because it's important to me that the students already have some idea of what an Austen novel is when they encounter the juvenilia. And almost without fail, one member of the class will volunteer the information that they wouldn't have believed the juvenilia were by Jane Austen. And it is therefore quite literally as if the students are encountering a new author at this stage of the course. And this is where we start to do some really explicit work of rethinking some of their previous prejudices about Austen. And of course, this shift doesn't come as a complete surprise, because by the 7th week of semester, the students know pretty well that I'm a teacher who likes to see the subversive fun in Jane Austen. But it does allow us to start to talk about the ways in which her reputation has been constructed and perpetuated, and about the effects this construction has had on their reading of the works. And this work leads well into the session on biography that follows the manuscript works, in which we discuss the memoir and the biopics Becoming Jane and Miss Austen Regrets. It also allows us to visit Patricia Rozema's Mansfield Park. I don't know how many of you have seen that film. It's the kind of controversial one which really foregrounds slavery in Mansfield Park. But it allows us to revisit that film, since the students can now see that part of what that film's doing is recreating Fanny Price in her creative image. And what they do is they use the juvenilia as the stories that the character Fanny sends back to her sister Susan in Portsmouth. So I teach Sanditon alongside the Watsons and Lady Susan, and for the first time in 2017, I was able to use Whit Stillman's adaptation of Lady Susan, misleadingly titled Love and Friendship, which I still don't really understand. Have people seen the Whit Stillman's Love? Yeah, it's great. They loved it. Prepared in the previous session on manuscript works, the students come to Sanditon expecting something rather different from the published novels, but they are still surprised by it. They're still surprised to find that this work of her maturity is so bitingly satirical, so extraordinarily exuberant. The Watsons, written in a more minor key, I think feels a bit more familiar to them. So on to Sanditon. Critical discussions of Sanditon tend to be coloured by its status as the last work, and hence the question of whether it represents the culmination of Austen's achievements as a novelist, or whether it fails to live up to her other works, showing weaknesses caused, by her illness. Although Sanditon's style has its defenders, myself among them, critics from R. Brimley Johnson and E.M. Forster to D.A. Miller have characterized Sanditon's style as a catastrophic failure, citing its careless and eroding grammar, that's Tony Tanner, its effects of weakness, that's E.M. Forster, and the breakdown registered on every page of the novel of what he calls Austen style in capital letters, that's D.A. Miller. A related critical debate arises regarding Sanditon's difference from or similarity to Austen's completed novels. B.C. Southern, for example, saw it as a new departure and the most capital R romantic of Austen's works. Alistair Duckworth considered it a radical departure from her previous modes of writing, and Marilyn Butler considered it to be a return to a more 18th century mode of writing. A number of critics, such as Clara Tuitt, John Halperin, Peter Knox-Shaw, Barrett Tandon, and John Wiltshire, have made the connection between Austen's state of bodily health and Sanditon's focus on invalidism and invalid bodies. And a final critical debate centres on whether Sanditon enacts a clash between tradition and novelty, and hence on the moral status of speculation and speculators in the fragment. And naturally, these questions shape our discussion in class also. But for me, the great value of Sanditon as a teaching text is that it foregrounds and makes explicit so many of the issues that are muted or implicit in Jane Austen's other novels, opening them up for discussion. The presence of the potentially mulatto, Miss Lamb, for example, allows us to discuss anew the references to slavery in Emma and Mansfield Park, and thus helps us to think about the great debates of Austen's time that are only glanced at elliptically in her novels. For example, the abolition question, female education, and the rights of man. Those are the huge questions of, I think, of Austen's period. Jane and Richard can put me right if I've got that wrong. Sanditon's hilariously upfront critique of invalids and invalidism reminds us of Austen's other invalids, hypochondriacs and valetudinarians, such as Mrs. Smith, Mary Musgrove, Mr. Woodhouse, incidentally, some of my favourite characters in Austen, and the ways in which illness is so often used strategically in Jane Austen's novels by both characters and their creator. So in my seminars, we discussed Louisa Musgrove's fall, Jane Bennet's cold at Netherfield, Marianne Dashwood's near-fatal illness, Kitty Bennet's coughs, and Jane Fairfax's tactical illnesses. And following John Wiltshire, we think about the ways in which female illness is so often the only way in which a woman can exercise any kind of control or agency in her life. While this emphasis is implicit in the completed novels, one of the things I love about Sanditon is it tells us this directly. Jane Austen tells us this. Yes. So this is Austen telling us directly that women's ill health is often the result of the displacement of mental energy. She says, it was impossible for Charlotte not to suspect a good, It was impossible for Charlotte not to suspect a good deal of fancy in such an extraordinary state of health. Disorders and recoveries, so very much out of the common way, seemed more like the amusement of eager minds in want of employment than of actual afflictions and relief. The Parkers were no doubt a family of imagination and quick feelings, and while the eldest brother found vent for his superfluity of sensation as a projector, the sisters were perhaps driven to dissipate theirs in the invention of odd complaints. So my very largely female students are often most interested in the status of and opportunities for women in Austen's time. And in the quotation there, Sanditon provides a good example of one of Jane Austen's few direct comments on the topic. I also obviously enjoy Anne Elliot's conversation with Captain Harville in The White Hart, where she talks about the limitations of women's opportunities in very direct terms. And I also quite enjoy Catherine Morland's comments on the lack of women in conventional masculine authored histories too. Now you may remember that Catherine doesn't like history because it's too full of the quarrels of popes and kings, and there are hardly any women at all in it. So the foregrounding of Sanditon as a place leads us to think about other settings and locations in Austen's novels, and about the metaphorical resonances of space and place that are perhaps most strongly felt in Mansfield Park, but are also really fundamental to Emma and Persuasion. Sanditon's position as a brand new resort town helps us to think about why such sites of social mobility and promiscuous social mixing might be troubling to conservative moralists. We remember Lydia Bennet's elopement from another seaside town, Brighton, Wickham's attempts at seducing Georgiana Darcy at Ramsgate, and Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax's reprehensible secret engagement that takes place in yet another seaside watering place, Weymouth. Social mobility more broadly is of course relevant to many of Jane Austen's other novels, and her approval of characters who are prepared to make their own way in life is perhaps most obvious in Persuasion, but also appears in Elizabeth's famous response to Lady Catherine de Bourgh. and in Emma's realization that she had been wrong about characters such as the Coles and Robert Martin. Although conversely, of course, she does not appear to approve of upwardly mobile schemers such as Lady Susan, Lucy Steele, or Isabella Thorpe. So we can kind of debate the extent to which social mobility is a good or bad thing in Austen's novels. Sanditon helped my students to see that Jane Austen isn't as socially conservative as they might originally have thought her to be, because of Sanditon's focus on the radical and seismic changes England was undergoing in the post-Napoleonic period. This is made manifest and visible through the contrast between the old and new villages of Sanditon. And it also opens up discussion of the many other manifestations of social change in Austen's other novels. Again, Persuasion provides the best example in the completed novels of the results of early 19th century societal upheavals, since the aristocratic Elliots are both literally and figuratively displaced by the upwardly mobile profs. But we can see hints of the demise of the aristocracy and the rise of those in trade from Pride and Prejudice onwards. So I suppose what I'm saying is studying Sanditon helps the students to identify such moments in the novels that they've already read. Sanditon returns to things and ideas that have preoccupied Jane Austen since her juvenilia, and that are also foregrounded in Northanger Abbey, a work that she may well have been revising at the same time as writing Sanditon. The first of these is her preoccupation with the construction and representation of a novelistic heroine. In each of Jane Austen's completed novels, she tries something different, experimental, and risky, according to the novels already in existence at the time, using the models that she knew, but either pushing them further or ironizing them. Sense and Sensibility experiments, as other writers had already done, with the structural possibilities of two contrasting heroines. But where her contemporaries such as Elizabeth Inchbald and Jane West had used the two heroine structure to provide fairly straightforward didactic comparisons, Jane Austen's seemingly opposed heroines are in fact much more similar than they are different. And Sense and Sensibility records not the triumph of sense over sensibility, but instead, I think, the need for an Aristotelian balance of the two. Pride and Prejudice gives its heroine the morally ambiguous quality of wit, bringing her precariously close to literary shrews like Shakespeare's Beatrice and Kate, and hence takes the risk of creating a heroine whom some readers did indeed think to be pert and vulgar. And those are quotations from Mary Russell Mitford. That's what she said about Elizabeth Bennet. Mansfield Park gives us what Linda A. Hall has called a reluctant heroine, one who seems more suited to the role of a minor character and who directly tells us that she, quotes, cannot act. Fanny nonetheless finds herself propelled into the center of the action and is forced to assume the agency she doesn't wish for. In Creep Mouse Fanny, Austen set herself the technical challenge of replacing novelistic excitement and action with steadfast goodness and creating a heroine who embodied that goodness. And that's an incredibly risky thing to do. In Emma, Austen deliberately created a heroine whom famously no one but myself will much like, while Anne Elliot is, by the standards of the day, way too old for the role of romantic heroine, 27. In all these cases, Jane Austen seems to have set herself a particular kind of challenge to create a new sort of heroine. Finally, the very notion of the novelistic heroine is directly satirized in Northanger Abbey, where its narratorial interjections leave us in no doubt that we are seeing a strongly ironic version of the sentimental or Gothic heroine. Catherine Morland, we're told directly, does not fit the bill. Unlike Sanditon's Clara Brereton, who is, quotes, elegantly tall, regularly handsome, with great delicacy of complexion and soft blue eyes, a sweetly modest and yet naturally graceful address, and hence seems to Charlotte, quotes, the most perfect representation of whatever heroine might be most beautiful and bewitching in all the numerous volumes they had left behind them on Mrs. Wilby's shelves in the circulating library. Catherine Morland has no pretensions to any of the characteristics of a circulating library heroine. Indeed, she represents the antithesis of these beautiful, educated, and vulnerable creatures. So Sanditon's cool observer heroine, Charlotte Hayward, oddly disengaged from the action, and not yet, by the end of the 12 existing chapters, fully known to us as readers, can therefore be seen either as the culmination of Jane Austen's radical experiments with the figure of the heroine, another heroine who, like Emma or Fanny, doesn't conform to our expectations, or potentially as a failure that Jane Austen might have put right with revision, and we don't know which of those things it is. Like Northanger Abbey, Sanditon also contains some further direct satire on the heroines most familiar to Jane Austen's readers, in the shape of Charlotte's musings on Clara Brereton as a perfect circulating library novel heroine. And this is on the screen. Perhaps it might be partly owing to her having just issued from a circulating library. This is Charlotte having just come out of the circulating library, but I think that issued is a pun because obviously books are issued. But she could not separate the idea of a complete heroine from Clara Brereton. Her situation with Lady Denham so very much in favour of it. She seemed placed with her on purpose to be ill-used. Such poverty and dependence joined to such beauty and merit seemed to leave no choice in the business. And here Jane Austen's mocking the books that come from circulating libraries that have such heroines in such positions and who are abused and so on. But on reflection, Charlotte realises that Clara isn't at all ill-treated. Well, she's a little bit ill-treated by Lady Denham, not super much. And she concludes that she is in fact therefore not a circulating library heroine. Although we learn that in Sir Edward Denham's fantasies, Clara is the subject of exactly the kind of plot beloved by Gothic novelists. At least in Sir Edward's mind, if not in reality, Clara is, quotes, the proper object of his seduction. And there's another quote, her situation in every way called for it. So the ironic attention then to the business of the seduction of the heroine, its cliched inevitability in a novel, shows us what Jane Austen thought of such plots and such heroines, reminding us of yet another text in which she mocks almost every aspect of the contemporary novel, the wonderfully satirical plan of a novel, which I also commit to. I can't go into it here. In Sir Edward Denham, we find another opportunity to discuss a theme that runs through Jane Austen's other novels, that of the quixote character, that is, someone led astray by his reading into believing in fantastical alternative realities. The name comes, of course, from Cervantes' famous novel Don Quixote, anglicised in the 18th century by Smollett's translation. Peter Knox-Shaw indeed sees the main theme of Sanditon to be quixotry. Catherine Morland provides the best known example of Austen's quixotes, but Persuasion's Captain Benwick wallowing in the morbidities of romantic poetry and Emma weaving her imaginist fantasies around Harriet Smith are two others. In addition to Smollett's translation of Don Quixote of 1755, Charlotte Lennox's The Female Quixote of 1752 and Eton Stannard Barrett's The Heroine of 1813 are clear influences on Jane Austen's depictions of these quixote characters. Sanditon's intertextual richness thus promotes discussion of the kinds of heroines, plots, and structural devices favoured by Jane Austen's predecessors, and helps the students to see her work as being in conversation with her contemporaries, as well as to identify its innovations and inventiveness. Sorry, I should put that up earlier. My mistake. There you go. There we are. And that's one of the Doré illustrations of Don Quixote there on the screen. Okay. In addition to the thematic and contextual connections that Sanditon helps to draw out, its style repays closer analysis. As Virginia Woolf put it, Austen's style always stimulates us to supply what is not there, because the trifle she provides expands in the reader's mind. Our imagination is therefore set to work to solve the enigmas of her writing style. Sanditon's style, with its elision, asyndeton, and parataxis, I'll define those on the screen, functions as an example of that enigmatic style writ large. And once students have encountered the terseness of Sanditon, they see such passages as the strawberry picking party in Emma with new eyes. So here's an example from Sanditon. This is Mr. Parker speaking. Such a place as Sanditon, sir, I may say was wanted, was called for. Nature had marked it out, had spoken in most intelligible characters. The finest, purest sea breeze on the coast, acknowledged to be so. Excellent bathing, fine hard sand, deep water 10 yards from the shore. No mud, no weeds, no slimy rocks. Never was there a place more palpably designed by nature for the resort of the invalid. The very spot which thousands seemed in need of. The most desirable distance from London. One complete measured mile nearer than Eastbourne. I love that complete measured mile. And here then is the strawberry picking party in Emma. And I hope you'll immediately see the similarities. The whole party were assembled excepting Frank Churchill, who was expected every moment from Richmond. And Mrs. Elton, in all her apparatus of happiness, her large bonnet and her basket, sorry, I just can't read this without laughing, was very ready to lead the way in gathering, accepting, or talking. Strawberries, and only strawberries, could now be thought of, spoken of. The best fruit in England, everybody's favourite, always wholesome. These the finest beds and finest soils, delightful to gather for oneself. The only way of really enjoying them. Morning decidedly the best time, never tired, every sort good. Oat boy infinitely superior, no comparison. The others hardly eatable. Oat boys very scarce, chili preferred, whitewood finest favourable. Price of strawberries in London, abundance about Bristol, maple grove, cultivation, beds meant to be renewed. Gardeners thinking exactly differently, no general rule. Gardeners never to be put out of their way. Delicious fruit, only too rich to be eaten much of, inferior to cherries, currants much more refreshing, only objection to gathering strawberries to stooping. Glaring sun, tired to death, could bear it no longer, must go and sit in the shade. Thank you. Tony Tanner thought Sanditon dizzying and excessive, hence his judgment that it was mainly a failure. But I don't think it's any more dizzying or excessive than the strawberry picking party in Emma. Anyway, in the classroom, the difficulties of its style are in fact helpful, I think. They allow discussion of other places in Jane Austen where the style slips or might seem messy, inappropriate, or surprising. And a good example of this is the frequently clotted syntax of Fanny's thoughts in Mansfield Park, which allows us to consider the problems of the realistic representation of painful or unthinkable thoughts. And what I mean by that is quite often Fanny gets herself tied up in knots in her thoughts because she cannot bring herself even to think the things that she actually knows in her heart. And so that's the same as in Sanditon, where we get Sir Edward's laboured and jargonistic literary criticism, and that kind of shows up the difficulties of effective parody to me. Perhaps most importantly, though, in my own classroom, Sanditon appropriately allows us to speculate, to ask the questions that the completed novels close off or relegate to ironic asides. Its unfinished nature prompts questions about endings and makes us think about the cancelled chapters of Persuasion, which of course would have given us a completely different ending. The alternative ending of Mansfield Park, which remains in the book. And by the alternative ending, I mean where Jane Austen says, you know, if Henry had remained faithful to Maria, the other marriages would definitely have happened. Fanny wouldn't have ended up married to Edmund, she would have married Henry. So, sorry, if Henry hadn't fallen for Maria. So yes, that posits the Fanny, Henry and Mary Edmund marriages as being entirely reasonable. We think about the fairly clumsy ending of Lady Susan, where it basically just says the letters came to an end to the great advantage of the post office full stop end. The ironised endings of Emma and Northanger Abbey, and the tradition of criticism begun by Marvin Moodrick that problematizes Sense and Sensibility's ending, seeing it as a betrayal of Marianne. And you may remember that what he writes is, Marianne has been betrayed, and not by Willoughby. Sanditon and the other unfinished works allow us to entertain the heretical idea that Jane Austen perhaps simply wasn't very good at endings. Or instead, we sometimes speculate Austen was uncomfortable with the necessity for a happy ending in a romance novel, and her ironic evasions might be, I'm not saying they are, might simply be strategic accommodations to the marketplace. Jane Austen's novels are certainly not straightforward wish fulfillment fantasies, as I think we all know. And discussion of her endings allows us to think about her extraordinary achievement in marrying the bleak realism of her depiction of women's life in Georgian England with her heroine's seemingly neat and conventional happy endings. Consideration of Sanditon's alternative titles, which are The Brothers and The Last Work, returns us to other alternative titles, First Impressions, Eleanor and Marianne, Susan, and makes us think about how titles can shift the emphasis of our reading. Sanditon also opens up discussion of sequels, prequels, and other creative responses to Austen's work, since it was one of the first of her works to enjoy such attention in the shape of her niece's continuation of the text, along with her nephew's attempts to continue Evelyn and Catherine. It allows us to think about the processes of revision and rewriting. The extent of the deletions, insertions, and revision of whole-scale passages visible in the manuscript, the inherent messiness of the process of writing, often comes as a shock to students, which helps them to see how much was and is, as Catherine Sutherland has pointed out, invested in notions of Austen as a polished writer in our collective emphasis on her neatness and the perfection of her style. And just as a kind of aside, I think it's also really helpful for my students to see a really great author revising, to give them the idea that it might be a good idea to revise their own work occasionally as well. Anyway, so these kinds of insights are made possible because of the availability of a digital version of the Sanditon manuscript. Sorry, no, I haven't put it on the screen, my mistake. We use Catherine Sutherland's excellent Jane Austen fiction manuscript website to look at Sanditon, the cancelled chapters of Persuasion, and in a previous session, the history of England. And this strategy serves the twofold process of allowing us all to see and work on the manuscript text together in class. I do also set a print version of the text so they can compare them. But it also helps to encourage the students to think carefully about some of the other digital resources they use. Comparisons between a rigorous scholarly resource such as that one and some other digital resources, Wikipedia, that they sometimes resort to using can be salutary. Okay, I'm nearly done, I promise. Returning to my initial question then, why teach Sanditon? It must by now be obvious that my belief is that Sanditon's a teaching text par excellence. I might actually even teach Sanditon in preference to the completed novels if I was only allowed one, for all the reasons discussed above. So to summarise then, my reasoning is both critical and pedagogical. Recent work in Austen studies has, to my mind, categorically shown the importance of treating Austen as a subversive writer. While I think the radical Austen presented in Helena Kelly's recent book, Jane Austen, The Secret Radical, is a bit overstated, I am far more willing to subscribe to that than to notions of heritage Austen or dear Aunt Jane. I recognise the force of Marilyn Butler's arguments for an anti-Jacobin Austen. I don't think acknowledging her political conservatism in those very limited terms compels us to think of her as conservative in other ways. So teaching my students to see Austen's subversive qualities is really important to me as an Austen scholar and critic, and Sanditon alongside the juvenile works makes that task far easier. Secondly, my pedagogical belief is that our first job as teachers of literature is to show our students how to approach texts in new ways. If, as the Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky suggests, the purpose of literary art is to make objects unfamiliar, or as Percy Shelley puts it in his Defence of Poetry, to strip the veil of familiarity from the world and lay bare the naked and sleeping beauty, which is the spirit of its forms, then it seems to me that the purpose of teaching literature is doubly so. When students encounter Sanditon, its exuberant and unmuted satire, its stylistic messiness, its tantalising new departures, all help them to revise and reassess their assumptions and prejudices about Austen's work. It defamiliarises the seemingly known to them. Third, Sanditon's survival in manuscript allows us to think about the differences between manuscript and print and makes us consider the contemporary publishing market. This consideration opens out the field of book history, which is one of my kind of secondary critical fields, to students who are unfamiliar with methods of this mode of scholarship. Fourth, seeing Austen's revision to the manuscript makes us consider her as a process writer, an insight that is, to me, key to understanding her literary development and to understanding the works. And finally, I promised I was nearly there, didn't I? As Catherine Sutherland has pointed out, Jane Austen was an inveterate recycler whose novels enact a process of expansion and repetition, retracing the old ground and recovering and discovering it as new ground. If taught alongside the completed novels, then, Sanditon shows us Jane Austen revising, recycling, reinventing characters, plots, and ideas that appear throughout the juvenilia and the 6 novels. Students, I think, have a strong tendency to think about novels in isolation, and studying Sanditon's fundamental intertextuality therefore helps students to think afresh about Jane Austen's other works, and to consider them not just as individual novels, but as related productions, works in conversation with each other and with their predecessors and contemporaries. It thus helps to open the students' eyes both to Austen's literary depth and to her own astonishing inventiveness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was wonderful, enlightening as usual. Can I just ask you, first of all, how do your students relate to Jane Austen today and their lives? Do they think there are relevant facts that reflect on their lives today, or do they think it's completely too long ago and life was so different?
I think both, actually. So I think when they first start reading Jane Austen, they do think, well, this is completely different. But it's quite easy to point out some of the similarities that are still happening, actually. And the more they read and the more they kind of get into Jane Austen, the more they begin to see her as relevant. And I actually think her funniness is really crucial to that, because they do begin to see how you can kind of stand back ironically from someone who's you think is a total idiot, but who has power over you, for example. And that's really, I think that can be quite empowering sometimes for students. When we do talk about the kind of limitations of women's lives, often things really come out of that, which are kind of interesting in terms of gender hierarchies, problematic kind of gender behaviors that are still around today. So yes, I think they don't find her irrelevant, no. And I mean, if they did find her irrelevant and they came into my classroom, they said wouldn't, I would hope. Yeah, I think some of them take a bit of talking around and some of them are paid up fans already, if you know what I mean. But they definitely, by the end of the course, I think they can see quite a lot of what matters still in what she can tell us.
And I think she makes her character so clear as well. Yeah. And most of it's done through conversation.
Yeah.
which is different for young people today. You know, they are not
Yeah.
conversing as much verbally as we used to do. So that must be different for
Yeah,
them.
I think that is, and actually I hadn't really thought about that so much, but they seem to really enjoy the conversations. And maybe that's something they would like to be doing in arms even. So perhaps there is that kind of element of wish fulfillment in that as well. Yeah. I mean, I suppose I'm not sure I would really be able to relate Wentworth's letter to a text message, but I suppose you could try.
It's not the same.
It's definitely not the same, no.
There's no expression in text message. In
Can
verbal
imagine.
communication there is.
I just suddenly thought of him writing it as a text message with the heart emoji at strategic places. But yeah, no, I don't think you could really.
Anyone else with any questions today? Yes. John.
Okay, so my favourite bit in Sanditon is that bit where Charlie's come spirits being through the campus.
Fog and mist and things, yeah.
And she talks about it in that sentence and then you got the that James thing of seeing people that is intimate level that they watch sort of get like that. I don't think she's got that.
No, I don't think she has.
The other, and I cut the phrase wrong, something like
Yes, that's right. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So she's seen so far away and through the mist as a blob of womanish white. Yeah.
I love that because it's as if she's thinking of this character which she's starting to love.
Yeah.
She do what she likes.
Yeah.
With that love of life pain.
Yeah.
You don't yet know how she's going to do it.
I know, I love that. Jane Austen is kind of impressionist painter. Yeah.
And that sense of love and the potential character.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is amazing. And also I think it's really helpful in kind of thinking about how that narrative perspective is created as well, because they are far away and they can only see quite dimly, but we are told precisely what's happening. So although Charlotte couldn't possibly know what Sir Edward is saying to Clara at that point, we know that he's trying to seduce her because we've been told that that's his main objective in life, essentially. But we also know that she's not going to be seduced because we've been told that by the narrative voice. So there's kind of that multi-layered perspective going on as well, where Charlotte knows one thing and is kind of assuming some things, but we as the audience, readers rather, already know something that she doesn't, which I kind of is also really interesting about that particular scene. Like, yeah, I wish we could know where she would have gone with it. I wish we could.
No, keep going.
Thank you so much for this experience. The last time I saw Sanditon with the students, they seemed very interested in last week. I can't now remember this, but about Charlotte being the doctor that Sanditon was looking for because she goes around semi-diagnosing what's wrong with various people. And so I just wondered what you thought of that, whether that she's a potentially diagnostic heroine or a doctor heroine of some kind. They really liked it. I still think even
yeah, there's definitely something there, isn't there? Because the whole reason Mr. Parker leaves Sanditon is to find a doctor, to bring a doctor to Sanditon, because he thinks that more people will come there if there's a resident physician. So I guess metaphorically he brings her back, so she may be the doctor that he has gone in search of. Yeah, she doesn't really fix anything though, does she? At least not in the 12 chapters that we've got. But yeah, I mean, I'm definitely open to that as an interpretation. I think it would allow you to see some quite interesting things in it. I suppose there is a sense that Arthur Parker does kind of feel a bit ashamed so Arthur Parker's this invalidist brother who is actually quite a healthy young man, but he really enjoys doctoring himself. And eating too much butter on his toast and drinking too strong cocoa. And his sisters always say, oh no, you must have weak tea. Oh, I can't have green tea because it will completely paralyze my right side. Anyway, he's an absurd character. And there definitely is a sense that Charlotte is shaming him slightly out of some of those behaviors. But I don't think she really changes Lady Denham. I don't think she's necessarily, I mean, she's seeing everything that's going on in a really diagnostic way, but one would hope that a doctor might heal a bit more than just diagnose. But yeah, interesting. Thanks, Katie. I hadn't thought of that.
Just a question from a Zoom
Okay.
attendant. Did Katie say that most of her students are female? If so, could you comment on why that is?
Yes, I can. I did say that. It is true. About 80% of students who take English at Stirling are female anyway. So it's not unusual that most of them in the module would be female. Can I comment on broader structural reasons why English literature is now a largely female? No, I don't think I can actually. But yeah, the proportion is not unusual given that is our student body in the English department. That's all I can say, really.
Anyone else?
I was interested in the contrast between Persuasion, which, you know, to the casual reader is Jane Austen's last published novel, it's autumnal last published use, isn't it? And then you Sanditon and oh, okay, so we're back to the burlesque. Why do you think there's a reason for that? Is she just trying out different things? It's almost like Back to the Future.
Yeah. I suppose there's two answers to that, and I don't know which one is true. I don't think anyone could know. The first is that it's been there all along, and the completed novels get muted down, revised until they are as we know them now. And that exuberance probably was there in the earliest drafts of Persuasion, and then isn't in the final draft of Persuasion. Or the second is, yes, she definitely is trying something new. And as Richard was saying, she's trying different stylistic techniques in Sanditon. So that's definitely something that's happening. But she's also going back to stuff that was there right at the very beginning in the Juvenilia. And same as some of the same authors get parodied, some of the same ideas get parodied. So it's maybe a combination of both, perhaps, is that it has been there all along, but she's also wanted to go in new directions. And I mean, she didn't know she was going to die, of course. So I'm happy to say. So, you know, there's no reason to think that she wasn't wanting to experiment and just see where she went with this particular new work. But yeah, so much of it is there in like on day one as well.
Anyone else like to ask a question?
How Stirling students treat
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a really good point. They find it hilarious in Sanditon, but they don't find it at all funny in the other novels, which is really interesting to me. So they find Mr. Woodhouse annoying, basically, I think, which maybe we all do. And certainly in that newest film version of Emma, where he's always having the screens put around himself and he's kind of swathed from her, they really play that up, which I think works quite well. I think they feel quite sorry for Mary Musgrove, even though she's clearly a hypochondriac, and it's very obvious that she is. But I think they see her as someone who's kind of more sinned against than sinning, interestingly. But they do find the hypochondriacs in Sanditon funny. And there is quite, I think, although there is a lot of health anxiety, it's not as much direct towards physical health, I think. I think it's more direct towards mental health. So people who they can see or think of as being suffering from depression or anxiety or those kind of common mental health issues that they're very familiar with, they don't want to laugh at. But, you know, Arthur Parker, paralysis by green tea, they do find properly funny. So I think it kind of depends, but there's definitely bodily health is still potentially amusing to them, although not always, whereas mental health, absolutely not. I should say I haven't taught this module now for 4 years, and I'm going to be teaching it again next year. So it'd be really interesting to me to see if there's been a kind of paradigm shift since COVID, and a lot of these things have come more to the fore.
Thank you very much, and I'm so glad to see some of our previous speakers have joined us today. It's lovely to see you. thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your contribution. That was very interesting. I'm now going to call on Sharon to give a vote of thanks.
Members and guests, I have my short manuscript here to do my vote of thanks on. Oh heavens, Katie, I don't know where I want to start. This has just been so magnificent. It always gives me a great pleasure to give a vote of thanks to any of our guest speakers. But as Katie and myself were discussing at lunch, we met at a London branch meeting at 14 years ago at least, but I think she's making that up. I think it was only just a few years ago. But back to this afternoon's lecture. I have to admit, I gave up on Sanditon on the TV, but it did make me pick up the Cambridge volume, all the junior works and things. And I think that's what it's all about at the end, that unmeasurable drip feed, which we don't know much about. It did show the changes and development of Jane Austen's writing. And that's the bit which makes you smile, makes you laugh, and makes you think about how she got from A to B and to Z and produced all this amazing work. I think we could do a quiz of branch members on, are you a prudish spinster? Yeah, that's me. A pretentious killjoy? Yeah, that's me. Or just an escapism Janeites, and I'm sure that's everybody else all around here. It's great to see Jane Austen's handwriting being used as a backdrop, and that makes us always remember that she wrote and then she scores things out, and she wrote and she scores things out. A bit like myself when I was trying to prepare my talk. It's really good. Thank you for giving us a quick recap of Sanditon, as the television forgot lots about this, and it's an understatement. And Katie has proved that it's far much more to Sanditon than what we give it credit for. And I think we should all go home and read it again and have a look at it. It's great when your speaker makes you think about something as well. Your favourite novel and heroine. Anne Elliot in Persuasion, who's too old at 26? What hope have I got at 66, I ask myself. The example from Sanditon and Mr. Parker speaking shows how the English language is so complicated, and if English is my second language, I feel for that person reading all that and writing that. And also Emma, that must be the fastest bit of lecturing we've ever heard in the Jane Austen Society. But we shouldn't forget, as Professor Cronin said in one of his lectures, Jane Austen was in fact a very clever and very fine writer, much more than many people think and give her credit for. And you proved that this afternoon as well. Regency's ladies reading about drunkenness, murder, suicide and financial speculation sounds more like something out of a Val McDermott novel of the 2020s than Regency reading. And I'm going to remember that on World Book Day. And they all go poo, poo, poo when I go around in my Jane Austen costume and say how boring all those things are. But Katie, in all seriousness, this is an incredibly well-researched and well-presented lecture this afternoon, given with enthusiasm, which you show with no bounds of passion giving up. It must be the first lecture with the longest set of websites I've ever seen in my entire life. And I'd love to know where you get your illustrations from. Further talks, Katie, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Jane Austen Lee's memoir of Here's Aunt Jane, or Roger Kipling's short story. But please, ladies and gentlemen members, could you show your ginormous appreciation for an incredibly talented speaker we've had this afternoon. Thank you, Katie.